The scent of freshly baked cinnamon apple pie wafted through the dusty main street of Silverton, Colorado, drawing curious glances from passers-by, as Lillian O'Connor wiped the sweat from her brow with a flour-dusted hand. The summer of 1876 had brought relentless heat to the mining town, but Lillian couldn't afford to miss a day of sales, not when Pa's medical bills kept piling up like the mountains that surrounded them. Fresh pies, the best in the territory. She called out, her voice straining to be heard over the cacophony of horses' hooves, carriage wheels, and the constant clanging from the silver mines that gave the town its name and purpose. The small wooden stand she'd constructed from discarded crates wasn't much to look at, but the artful display of golden-crusted pies spoke for themselves. Raspberry, apple, peach, and her special recipe wild huckleberry with a touch of honey lined up in neat rows, steam still rising from the ones she'd pulled from Mrs. Wilkins' oven just an hour ago. Lillian straightened her simple calico dress, painfully aware of its worn edges and twice-mended tears. At 22, she'd once dreamed of fine dresses and perhaps a teaching position at the schoolhouse. But that was before her father's mining accident last winter. Before her mother passed from pneumonia 2 years prior. Before the O'Connor family name became synonymous with debt in Silverton. "How much for the apple?" a miner asked, his face blackened with coal dust except for the rings around his eyes. "2 bits, sir," Lillian answered with a practiced smile. "Baked fresh this morning." The man grumbled but fished the coins from his pocket. One sale wasn't enough to cover today's flour, let alone contribute to Pa's care, but it was a start. As the afternoon crawled on, Lillian sold 3 more pies, enough to perhaps buy medicine, but not enough for both that and tomorrow's ingredients. She was contemplating whether to lower her prices when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. The rider was tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Lillian could make out the details: a well-worn hat pulled low, a duster coat covered in trail dust, and the unmistakable jingle of spurs with each step his chestnut mare took. The stranger dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. When he turned toward her stand, Lillian caught her breath. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his jaw too strong, his eyes too intense beneath those dark brows, but something about him made her heart flutter like a startled bird. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and rough, like stones rolling down a dry creek bed. "Those pies smell like heaven itself." "Thank you, sir," Lillian replied, unconsciously smoothing her apron. "Would you care to try one? What would you recommend?" There was a gentleness to his question that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "The huckleberry is my mother's special recipe," she offered, "though the apple is quite popular as well." He studied the pies, then looked up at her with eyes the color of a summer storm. "I'll take them all." Lillian blinked. "I beg your pardon, all of them," he repeated, reaching into his coat. "Every pie you have." "But sir, that's," she did a quick calculation, "nearly $3 worth." "I've been riding for 2 weeks with nothing but jerky and hardtack," he explained, laying $5 on the counter. "And I've got hungry men back at our camp. This should cover it, with something extra for your trouble." Lillian stared at the money. $5 was more than she usually made in 3 days. "Sir, this is too generous." "Not generous enough, I'd wager." He glanced at her worn boots and the thin shawl draped over the back of her chair. "Is this your only means of income, miss?" "O'Connor, Lillian O'Connor," she supplied. "And yes, since my father's accident, the pies have kept us afloat, barely." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "Mason Rourke," he introduced himself. I'm foreman for the new Silver Creek operation. Lillian's breath caught. Everyone in town had heard about the new mining company moving in, rumored to have backing from wealthy Denver investors. The one taking over the abandoned Elkhorn site, he nodded. We've got 20 men setting up camp now and another 30 arriving next week. He looked at her humble stand. Seems to me those men will need feeding. Your pies might find a ready market. Hope bloomed in Lillian's chest before wilting just as quickly. I'd need more supplies, a larger oven. She shook her head. It's a kind thought, Mr. Rourke, but beyond my means. Mason looked thoughtful, his fingers drumming against the wooden counter. What if I were to advance you the money for supplies? In exchange for, say, exclusive rights to your pies for my men? Lillian's eyes widened. You do that for a stranger? A hint of a smile cracked his weathered face. I'm a businessman, Miss O'Connor. Good food keeps men happy. Happy men work harder. He paused. Though I admit these pies would tempt a saint to gluttony. She couldn't help but laugh at that, the sound surprising her when had she last truly laughed. You haven't even tasted them yet, Mr. Rourke. Then I'll remedy that right now. He picked up the huckleberry pie and took a generous bite. His eyes closed momentarily, and when they opened again, there was a new warmth in them. Miss O'Connor, I'd like to buy your recipe book as well. My recipes? But they're family secrets. I'm not asking you to part with them permanently, but if I'm to finance this venture, I need some assurance of its value. He gestured to the pies. These recipes are clearly worth something. Lillian hesitated, glancing at the tattered book peeking from her basket. Her mother's handwriting filled those pages, not just recipes, but memories, snippets of wisdom, pressed flowers from springs long past. I understand your hesitation, Mason said softly. But sometimes we must risk what we treasure to preserve what we love. Your father needs medicine, doesn't he? She looked up sharply. How did you know? Small towns have big ears, Miss O'Connor. Word gets around. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another $10. This for the recipe book as collateral only. Once our business arrangement proves profitable, you'll get it back. Lillian stared at the money, her mind racing. It was enough to pay off their most pressing debts and buy Pa's medicine for months. With a steady income from baking for the miners, she might even afford to call the doctor from Durango. I'll need the book back, no matter what, she said firmly. And I want to be the one to bake from it. No one else touches my mother's recipes. Mason nodded. Fair enough. We have a deal then. She took a deep breath, then extended her hand. We have a deal, Mr. Rourke. His large hand enveloped hers, calloused and warm. The touch sent an unexpected shiver up her arm, and she quickly withdrew. I'll send a wagon for the pies tomorrow morning, he said, seemingly unaffected by the moment that had left her flustered. Can you have a dozen ready by 8? Yes, she answered, her mind already calculating ingredients and baking times. I'll need to use Mrs. Wilkins' oven again, but yes. Mason carefully gathered the remaining pies into a wooden crate he took from the back of his horse. Until tomorrow, then, Miss O'Connor. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Lillian clutched the $15 to her chest, hardly believing her sudden change in fortune. Only when he disappeared around the corner did she realize he had taken her recipe book along with the pies. For a moment, panic seized her. Had she been duped? But no, Mason Rourke didn't strike her as a swindler. There was something honest in those storm-gray eyes, something trustworthy despite his rough exterior. With newfound energy, Lillian packed up her stand. Tomorrow would begin early, but for the first time in months, she felt something like hope fluttering in her chest, fragile as pie crust, but just as promising. The next morning arrived with the soft golden light that made the Colorado mountains seem painted against the sky. Lillian had barely slept, rising well before dawn to mix dough and prepare fillings. Mrs. Wilkins, her elderly neighbor, had been delighted by the prospect of steady income for the use of her oven, and had generously offered Lillian the use of her larger work table as well. By 7:30, a dozen pies cooled on the windowsill, 6 apple, 4 peach, and 2 of her special huckleberry. Without her mother's recipe book, Lillian had relied on memory, hoping she'd recalled the precise balance of spices that made her mother's pies so distinctive. "Lord have mercy, child," Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed, entering the kitchen in her nightcap. "You've been busy as a beaver. Is that cowboy of yours really paying for all these?" "He's not my cowboy," Lillian corrected, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "He's a business associate." Mrs. Wilkins cackled, her wrinkled face creasing further. "Business associate? Is that what they're calling it these days? Well, he's a fine-looking man if rough around the edges. About time you had someone looking out for you." "It's purely business," Lillian insisted, carefully wrapping each pie in clean muslin. "Mr. Rourke needs food for his miners, and I need income." "And I need these dishes washed," Mrs. Wilkins retorted good-naturedly. "But there's no harm in appreciating the view when a man like that comes calling." Lillian was saved from responding by the sound of a wagon approaching outside. She hastily wiped her hands on her apron and smoothed back strands of auburn hair that had escaped her simple bun. But it wasn't Mason Rourke who appeared at the door instead. A young man with a shock of red hair and freckles knocked tentatively. "Miss O'Connor?" he asked. "I'm Timothy, Mr. Rourke's assistant. He sent me for the pies." Lillian tried not to feel disappointed. "Of course, they're ready." Timothy carefully loaded the pies into the wagon, promising to return the empty containers the next day. He handed her an envelope. "Mr. Rourke said to give you this." Inside was payment for the pies exactly as promised, plus a note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Miss O'Connor, your recipes are extraordinary. My men devoured yesterday's pies and demanded more. I've taken the liberty of ordering supplies to be delivered to Mrs. Wilkins' home this afternoon. If the arrangement continues to satisfy, I propose doubling tomorrow's order. Respectfully, M. Rourke. P.S. Your recipe book is safe. I hope to return it to you personally when time permits." Lillian read the note twice, a smile spreading across her face. Just as promised, a delivery wagon arrived that afternoon bearing flour, sugar, butter, and fruits enough for days of baking. There was even a set of new pie tins and a rolling pin of fine-grained maple. For 2 weeks, the arrangement continued smoothly. Every morning, Timothy collected the pies, and every afternoon supplies arrived as needed. The steady income allowed Lillian to pay off the most pressing of her father's medical debts and even hire a nurse to visit twice weekly. But of Mason Rourke himself, she saw nothing. "Perhaps he's avoiding me," she confessed to Mrs. Wilkins one evening as they sat on the porch, shelling peas for the next day's chicken pot pies, a new addition to her offerings that had proven popular with the miners. "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilkins replied. "Men like that don't have time for social calls when they're setting up operations. He's probably working from sunup to sundown." "I suppose," Lillian agreed, trying to ignore the irrational disappointment she felt. "It's just, he still has my mother's recipe book." "And that's all you're concerned about?" Mrs. Wilkins asked shrewdly, before Lillian could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of her confused feelings. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A familiar chestnut mare appeared, its rider silhouetted against the sunset. "Speaking of the devil," Mrs. Wilkins murmured, gathering her shawl, "I think I'll turn in early tonight. These old bones need their rest." "Mrs. Wilkins, don't you dare!" But the older woman had already disappeared inside, leaving Lillian alone on the porch as Mason Rourke dismounted and approached. "Miss O'Connor," he greeted her, removing his hat. 2 weeks of hard work had left their mark. His face was more tanned. A healing cut ran along one cheekbone, and his hands bore fresh calluses. Yet his eyes remained the same intense, searching, surprisingly kind beneath their initial sternness. "Mr. Rourke," she returned, suddenly aware of her flour-dusted apron and wayward curls. "This is a surprise. A pleasant one, I hope." He held out a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "I've come to return what's yours." Lillian's heart leapt as she recognized her mother's recipe book, but when she reached for it, he didn't immediately release it. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping we might discuss a new proposal. Is there somewhere we could talk?" The proper thing would be to invite him inside, but with Mrs. Wilkins likely eavesdropping and her father asleep, the porch seemed safest. "Here is fine if you don't mind the evening chill." He nodded and settled onto the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Your pies have transformed our camp. The men work harder, complain less, and actually look forward to meal times." "I'm glad to hear it," Lillian said, genuinely pleased. The steady income had transformed her life as well, bringing a security she hadn't known since before her father's accident. "The thing is," Mason continued, "we're setting up more permanent operations. The initial surveys show more silver than we first expected, and we're building proper structures rather than just tents." "That's wonderful news for Silverton," Lillian said. "More miners meant more business for everyone." "Yes, but it presents a problem for our arrangement." He turned to face her fully. "The distance between town and our site is becoming impractical for daily deliveries, especially once winter sets in." Lillian's heart sank. "You're ending our agreement, just the opposite." His eyes held hers steadily. "I want to expand it. I'm proposing to build a proper kitchen and dining hall at the site, and I'd like you to run it." Lillian stared at him. "You want me to leave Silverton?" "Only during the day. We'd provide transportation to and from town." He gestured to the recipe book. "You'd have complete control of the kitchen, prepare meals according to your judgment, and be paid twice what you're earning now." The offer was generous, more than generous. With that kind of income, she could pay off all her father's debts within months, perhaps even save enough to consider the future beyond mere survival. "What about my father?" she asked. "He needs care." "I've thought of that," Mason said, and something in his tone made her realize he'd given this considerable consideration. "There's a doctor joining us from Denver next month. He'd be available to check on your father regularly at no cost to you." Lillian's thoughts raced. The opportunity was extraordinary, but the idea of working directly under Mason Rourke's supervision brought a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with professional concerns. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You could hire a professional cook from Denver or Durango." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I could, but they wouldn't have your recipes or your touch. Besides, I believe in supporting the local community whenever possible." Something in his expression suggested there was more to it than simple business sense, but Lillian didn't dare probe further. "May I have some time to consider your offer, of course?" He stood, placing her recipe book gently in her hands. "Take until the end of the week. Timothy will continue the regular pickups until then." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Lillian felt that same unexpected shiver race up her arm. From the slight widening of Mason's eyes, she wondered if he'd felt something too. "Good night, Miss O'Connor," he said, his voice perhaps a touch lower than before. "Good night, Mr. Rourke." She watched him ride away, clutching her mother's recipe book to her chest. Only when he disappeared into the gathering darkness did she open it, finding a pressed wildflower marking a page, a columbine, Colorado's state flower. Must have been placed there by Mason. The discovery sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the mild summer evening. 3 days later, Lillian found herself bouncing along in a wagon beside Timothy, headed for the Silver Creek mining camp. She'd accepted Mason's offer, partly out of practical necessity and partly out of a curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. The camp was larger than she'd expected, a small settlement taking shape among the pines. Tents were being replaced by simple cabins, and the clang of hammers mingled with the deeper sounds of mining operations. At the center stood a substantial log structure, smoke already rising from its stone chimney. "That's your domain," Timothy explained, helping her down from the wagon. Mr. Rourke had it built first, even before his own quarters. The kitchen was a revelation, spacious, with 2 large iron stoves, ample workspace, and shelves already stocked with supplies. Sunlight streamed through actual glass windows, illuminating a dining area that could seat 50 men. "This is incredible," Lillian breathed, running her hand over the smooth countertop. "Far better than I expected." "Mr. Rourke's particular about doing things right the first time," Timothy replied. "Says it saves trouble later." As if summoned by his name, Mason appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling it completely. "Does it meet with your approval, Miss O'Connor?" "It's perfect," she said honestly, "though I fear my skills may not live up to such grand surroundings." "Your skills are precisely why these surroundings exist." He gestured to a small office adjacent to the kitchen. "There's a space for your administrative work, menus, inventory, orders. I've taken the liberty of hiring 2 local girls to assist with serving and cleaning." The thoroughness of his planning impressed her. "You seem to have thought of everything." "Not quite everything." A hint of uncertainty crossed his features, the first she'd seen in him. "There's the matter of your reputation to consider." Lillian tensed. "My reputation?" "A young, unmarried woman working among so many men." He cleared his throat. "Some in town might talk. I've arranged for Mrs. Peterson, you know her from the general store, to act as chaperone for the first few weeks. She'll be arriving shortly." Relief flooded her. He'd considered her standing in the community, something many employers would ignore. "That's very thoughtful." Mason nodded, seemingly relieved by her reaction. "I'll leave you to familiarize yourself with your kitchen. The men break for lunch at noon." He turned to go, then paused. "I'm glad you accepted, Miss O'Connor. Very glad indeed." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with a flutter in her chest and a kitchen to organize. The next weeks fell into a pleasant rhythm. Lillian arrived each morning with the supply wagon, spent the day cooking and baking, and returned to town in the evening. The miners treated her with surprising respect, partly, she suspected, because of Mason's silent watchfulness, and partly because no man wanted to risk losing access to her cooking. Mason himself remained something of a mystery. He appeared daily to check on operations but rarely lingered. Their conversations were brief, professional. Yet Lillian found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the sound of his voice in the yard, the glimpse of his tall figure supervising construction, the occasional moment when she'd look up to find his eyes on her from across the dining hall. One rainy afternoon, as Lillian was preparing to leave, Mason entered the kitchen, his duster dripping onto the wooden floor. "The creek's rising," he said without preamble. "The road to town will be washed out within the hour." Lillian's heart sank. "But my father, I've already sent word with one of the riders who left before the worst hit. Your father will be looked after." He removed his hat, running a hand through damp hair. "I'm afraid you'll need to stay the night. Mrs. Peterson has offered to share her quarters with you." "Oh." Lillian tried to hide her dismay. It wasn't that she distrusted the miners, but the thought of being separated from her father during a storm unsettled her. Something in her expression must have revealed her concern, for Mason's face softened. "He'll be fine, Lillian, I promise." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice momentarily distracted her from her worries. "Thank you," she said softly. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof. "Since you're here," Mason said suddenly, "perhaps you join me for dinner. In my cabin. I've been meaning to discuss expanding the menu for the coming winter months." The invitation surprised her, but with Mrs. Peterson as chaperone, it would be perfectly proper. "I'd like that." Mason's cabin, like everything else he touched, was a study in practical efficiency. A single room served as office, dining area, and living quarters, with a small stove providing heat against the autumn chill. The furnishings were simple but of good quality: a desk piled with maps and ledgers, a bookcase filled with volumes on mining and geology, a table set for three. Mrs. Peterson bustled about, making them comfortable before excusing herself, just for a moment, to fetch something from her quarters. The moment stretched into many, leaving Lillian alone with Mason in a silence that grew increasingly charged. "Your father," Mason said finally. "How is he faring?" Lillian welcomed the safe topic. "Much better, thank you. The doctor you sent has been a godsend. He believes Pa might even regain some use of his left arm with time." "That's excellent news." Mason poured her a cup of coffee, a luxury in these parts, but one she'd come to learn he insisted upon. "And you? Are you finding the arrangement satisfactory?" "More than satisfactory," she answered honestly. "The income has changed our lives, Mr. Rourke." "Mason," he corrected gently. "After all this time, I think we've earned the right to first names, don't you?" The simple request sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Mason, then." He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face and made her heart skip. "And may I call you Lillian?" "You already did," she pointed out, returning his smile. "Earlier in the kitchen." A touch of color appeared on his tanned cheeks. "So I did. I hope you'll forgive the liberty." "There's nothing to forgive." She took a sip of coffee to hide her own warming face. Mason seemed about to say something more when the door opened, admitting not only Mrs. Peterson but also a gust of wind and rain. "Gracious!" the older woman exclaimed. "It's coming down in sheets now." "I do hope everyone battened down properly." The moment broken, they turned to dinner, a simple affair of venison stew and freshly baked bread that Lillian herself had prepared that morning. The conversation remained general, with Mrs. Peterson filling any potential silences with town gossip and questions about the progress of the mine. Only once, as Mason passed Lillian the bread basket, did their fingers brush. The contact was brief, but the look that passed between them lingered far longer. When the meal ended, Mrs. Peterson yawned pointedly. "Well, these old bones need rest. Lillian, dear, shall we retire?" Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling through the pines and rain hammering against the cabin walls. As they prepared to brave the short walk to Mrs. Peterson's quarters, Mason insisted on escorting them with a lantern. At the door, as Mrs. Peterson stepped inside, Mason touched Lillian's arm lightly. "Sleep well," he said, his voice nearly lost in the storm's fury. "And don't worry about your father. Good men look after their own in weather like this." The simple assurance, coupled with the warmth in his eyes, stayed with Lillian long into the night as she listened to the rain and Mrs. Peterson's gentle snoring. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world and several washed-out sections of road. It would be midday before the route to town was passable, so Lillian threw herself into preparing breakfast for the miners, many of whom had spent the night shoring up equipment against the downpour. She was kneading dough for biscuits when Mason appeared, earlier than usual. "I rode out at first light to check the road," he explained, accepting the cup of coffee she offered, "and to inquire after your father." Lillian's hands stilled in the dough. "And he's well. Concerned about you, but well. I assured him you were safe and would return as soon as possible." He hesitated. "I hope you don't mind that I introduced myself to him." The thought of Mason meeting her father sent a flutter of anxiety through her, not because she feared her father's reaction, but because the meeting suggested a personal interest that transcended their business arrangement. "Not at all," she said carefully. "What did you think of him?" "I found him to be a man of character," Mason answered, his eyes steady on hers. "I can see where you get your strength." The compliment warmed her. "He's the best of men despite his gruff exterior." "I recognized that quality immediately," Mason said with the hint of a smile. "Being somewhat gruff myself." Lillian laughed, surprising herself with the ease she felt in his presence. "You hide a good heart beneath that stern foreman's manner, Mason Rourke." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't glimpsed before. "Do I?" Before she could respond, one of the miners burst into the kitchen, his face urgent. "Boss, there's trouble at the north shaft." The moment shattered, Mason was instantly alert. "What kind of trouble?" Support beams cracked. "Jenkins says it won't hold past noon." Mason was already moving. "Get Thornton and his crew, tell them to bring the reinforcement timbers." He turned back to Lillian, his face apologetic. "Duty calls." "Go," she urged. "Be careful." He paused just long enough to say, "We'll finish this conversation another time," before disappearing into the bustling camp. The road to town remained impassable until late afternoon, by which time Lillian had not only prepared 3 meals for the hungry miners, but also learned that Mason himself had entered the unstable shaft to direct the reinforcement efforts. The knowledge that he'd willingly placed himself in danger twisted her stomach into knots, forcing her to confront feelings she'd been carefully avoiding. When Timothy finally announced the wagon was ready to take her home, Mason was still at the north shaft. She left a covered plate of food for him with one of the miners, along with a hastily scribbled note. "Your safety matters to many. Please take care." Lillian, it wasn't until she was halfway to town, watching the setting sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, that she realized just how much his safety mattered to her personally. The next morning, Lillian arrived at the camp to find a small glass vase on her work table, containing a single columbine like the one he'd pressed into her recipe book, but fresh and vibrant. Beside it lay a note in Mason's distinctive handwriting. "Your concern matters to me. Thank you." The simple acknowledgement set the tone for the weeks that followed, a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in their relationship. Nothing improper, nothing that would raise eyebrows. Yet Lillian found herself looking forward to their brief daily interactions with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Mason began finding reasons to visit the kitchen more frequently, checking on supplies, discussing menu changes, occasionally even lingering to taste a new recipe. For her part, Lillian found herself rising earlier to ensure her hair was neatly arranged, adding small touches to her simple dresses, and setting aside the best portions of whatever she baked, knowing he would appear. As October painted the aspens golden and the first hints of winter crept into the mountain air, rumors began to circulate through camp about expansion plans, new shafts, new equipment from Denver, even talk of a smelter to be built come spring. "Is it true?" Lillian asked one evening as she and Mason walked back from the newly constructed storehouse where she'd been taking inventory. Mrs. Peterson trailed discreetly behind them, her presence ensuring propriety while her poor hearing afforded them some privacy. "Some of it," Mason admitted. "The initial yields have exceeded expectations. We're planning to double operations by next summer. That's wonderful news for Silverton. And potentially for their arrangement as well," Lillian thought. "Yes, but it means decisions must be made soon." He slowed his pace, glancing back to ensure Mrs. Peterson was still following. "Including decisions about more permanent facilities, a proper boarding house for the miners, expanded offices, perhaps even a company store." Lillian's mind immediately leapt to the implications for her position. "And the dining hall. Will you be seeking a more permanent arrangement there as well?" Mason stopped walking entirely, turning to face her. In the golden light of late afternoon, his features seemed softer, his eyes more revealing. "That depends entirely on you, Lillian." Her heart quickened. "On me. On whether you see a future here." His voice lowered. "On whether you might consider making your position permanent." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond a simple employment offer. Before Lillian could formulate a response, shouts erupted from the direction of the main shaft. "Fire! Fire in the east tunnel!" Mason's reaction was immediate. "Get to the kitchen," he ordered Lillian. "We may have injured men soon." Then he was running toward the commotion, leaving Lillian with her answer unspoken and her heart in her throat. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. 3 miners suffered burns and smoke inhalation before the fire was contained. Lillian turned her kitchen into an impromptu infirmary, brewing willow bark tea for pain, applying honey to burns, and preparing broth for those too weak to eat solid food. Mason coordinated the firefighting efforts, disappearing into the smoke-filled tunnel despite his men's protests, and emerging with an unconscious miner slung over his shoulder. His face was blackened with soot, his shirt singed in places, yet he refused to rest until every man was accounted for. It was past midnight when the last injured miner was stabilized, and the fire declared fully extinguished. Lillian, exhausted but unable to leave while men still needed care, was wiping down her work table when Mason finally entered the kitchen. He'd washed the worst of the soot away, but fatigue lined his face, and a nasty burn marked one forearm where his sleeve had caught fire. "You need that treated," Lillian said, gesturing to his arm. "It's nothing," he insisted, but allowed her to lead him to a chair. She worked in silence, gently cleaning the burn and applying the honey mixture she'd used for the others. His arm was muscled and strong beneath her fingers, the skin warm despite his exhaustion. "You were incredibly brave today," she said softly. "Foolhardy, perhaps, but brave." "Those men are my responsibility," he answered simply. "As are you." Lillian looked up, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "I was terrified," he continued, "when I realized how close the fire was to the kitchen, if anything had happened to you." "But it didn't," she assured him, finishing the bandage. "I'm perfectly fine." Mason's uninjured hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm. "Lillian, about what I was saying before the door swung open, admitting Timothy with a stack of blankets. "Boss, we've got the men settled, but Thornton's asking for you. Says there's structural damage that needs assessing before morning." Mason's jaw tightened briefly in frustration, but he nodded. "Tell him I'll be there shortly." As Timothy departed, Mason turned back to Lillian. "This conversation seems destined to be interrupted." "Perhaps that's for the best," she replied, suddenly aware of how improper their current situation might appear alone in the kitchen past midnight, his hand still covering hers. "You should see to your men. We can speak tomorrow." He reluctantly released her hand and stood. "Tomorrow, then, and Lillian, yes, thank you, for everything you did today. The simple gratitude in his voice warmed her more than any declaration might have. The following day brought the first snowfall of the season, a gentle dusting that transformed the camp into a winter wonderland. It also brought news that the doctor from Denver had finally arrived in Silverton and would be visiting the camp the next morning. Lillian was elbow-deep in pie dough when Mason appeared, a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman at his side. "Lillian, may I present Dr. James Whitfield?" Mason said formally. "Doctor, this is Miss Lillian O'Connor, the culinary genius responsible for keeping our miners so well fed and content." Dr. Whitfield's handshake was firm, his manner professional but kind. "Miss O'Connor, a pleasure. I've already heard about your remarkable pies from half the town." "You're too kind," Lillian replied, wiping flour from her hands. "Has Mason mentioned that my father is one of your patients?" "Indeed, and I visited him this morning before coming up to camp. A remarkable man, his progress is commendable given the severity of his injuries. I've left him with a new therapeutic regimen that should improve his mobility further." Relief flooded Lillian. "Thank you, doctor." "That's wonderful news. I've asked Dr. Whitfield to join us for dinner," Mason explained. "He'll be setting up a permanent practice in Silverton, dividing his time between town and our camp." The doctor's arrival marked a turning point for the mining operation. His presence meant injured men could be treated promptly, preventative care could be established, and the camp could operate year-round without fear of being cut off from medical assistance during the harsh winter months. It also meant that one of Lillian's primary concerns about her future, her father's medical care, was being addressed in a way that suggested Mason had given it considerable thought. That evening, as snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, Mason, Dr. Whitfield, and Lillian shared dinner in Mason's cabin. The conversation flowed easily, covering topics from the latest mining techniques to Denver society to Lillian's culinary background. "My mother taught me everything I know," she explained in response to the doctor's praise of her apple tart. "She had a gift for knowing exactly which spices would complement each fruit, how long to let a dough rest when a crust was perfectly done." "She must have been a remarkable woman," the doctor observed. "She was," Lillian agreed softly. "I still use her recipe book daily." "The famous recipe book," Mason interjected with a smile. "The collateral that started our business arrangement." Dr. Whitfield raised an eyebrow. "There must be a story there." Mason glanced at Lillian, his expression warm with shared memory. "Indeed there is." "Shall I tell it? Or would you prefer to, Lillian?" "Please, go ahead," she encouraged, curious to hear how he would relate their first meeting. Mason recounted the tale with surprising detail, the scent of pies that had drawn him to her humble stand, the determination he'd seen in her despite her circumstances, the immediate recognition that her talents were being wasted on occasional sales to passing miners. "I knew after the first bite of huckleberry pie that I'd found something precious," he concluded, his eyes meeting Lillian's across the table. "Something worth investing in." The way he said it, the tenderness in his voice, made it clear he was no longer speaking merely of pies or business arrangements. Dr. Whitfield, a perceptive man, glanced between them with interest. "It seems the investment has paid dividends for you both." "More than I ever expected," Mason agreed, his gaze still holding Lillian's. Later, as the doctor took his leave to return to his quarters, he paused beside Lillian. "I can see why Mason speaks so highly of you," he said quietly, "and not just for your culinary skills." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with Mason and a silence heavy with unspoken words. "Would you care to sit by the fire for a while?" Mason asked, gesturing to the comfortable chairs near the hearth. "The snow's coming down harder." Best to warm yourself before the walk back to town. It was proper enough the cabin door remained open, visible to any who might pass, and Mrs. Peterson would arrive soon to accompany her home. Lillian nodded, settling into the chair while Mason added another log to the fire. "Your father's improvement is encouraging," he said, taking the seat opposite hers. "Thanks to your generosity in bringing Dr. Whitfield here." Lillian smoothed her skirt nervously. "I'm beginning to wonder if I'll ever be able to repay all you've done for us." Mason leaned forward, his expression serious. "I don't want repayment, Lillian, I want—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "What do you want, Mason?" she asked softly, her heart beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "A future," he said simply. "One that includes you." The directness of his statement took her breath away. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Initially, a more permanent arrangement for you at the camp. A proper salary, a position as head of all domestic operations as we expand." He hesitated, then continued more carefully. "But in time, perhaps something more personal, if you were amenable." Lillian studied his face, the strong jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both hardship and laughter, the unwavering gaze that had first caught her attention all those weeks ago. "And if I were amenable," she said slowly, "what would that something more entail?" A flicker of vulnerability crossed his features. "I'm not a man given to flowery words, Lillian. I've lived most of my life in mining camps and on cattle drives. But these past months, watching you transform not just our meals but the very spirit of this camp, I've come to admire you deeply." He reached across the space between them, his hand extended, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. "I find myself thinking of you constantly. Your strength, your kindness, the way you faced adversity without losing your gentle nature." Lillian placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work. "I've come to care for you as well," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason's fingers closed gently around hers. "Then perhaps we might court properly, once things are more settled here, with your father's blessing, of course." The traditional approach touched her deeply. Despite his rugged exterior and the unconventional beginning of their acquaintance, Mason was at heart a man of honor. "I'd like that very much," she replied. The smile that spread across his face transformed him, erasing the weariness and worry that his position so often required him to wear. For a moment, he looked younger, almost boyish in his happiness. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled Mrs. Peterson's arrival. Mason reluctantly released Lillian's hand but continued to gaze at her with newfound openness. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, rising to meet Mrs. Peterson at the door. As they made their way down to the waiting wagon that would take them to town, the older woman gave Lillian a knowing look. "Well, dear, has he finally spoken up?" Lillian's surprise must have shown on her face for Mrs. Peterson chuckled. "Oh, come now. Half the camp has been watching the two of you dance around each other for weeks. It was only a matter of time." Despite the cold, warmth flooded Lillian's cheeks. "We've agreed to court properly once things are more settled." Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. "He's a good man, that Mason Rourke. Rough-hewn, perhaps, but solid to the core. You could do far worse." As the wagon carried them down the mountain toward Silverton, snow falling gently around them, Lillian gazed back at the lights of the mining camp. Somewhere up there, Mason was likely still awake, perhaps thinking of her as she was thinking of him. For the first time since her mother's death and her father's accident, the future seemed full of promise rather than uncertainty. The winter of 1876-1877 proved to be one of the harshest in Colorado's memory. Snow piled in drifts higher than a man's head, winds howled down from the peaks with bitter fury, and temperatures dropped so low that mercury froze in thermometers. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, both the Silver Creek mining operation and Lillian's relationship with Mason flourished. With travel between town and camp frequently impossible, Mason had a small cabin built for Lillian near the dining hall. Mrs. Peterson moved in as well, serving as both companion and assistant as Lillian's responsibilities expanded. Together, they oversaw not only the meals but also the laundry, medical supplies, and general comfort of the miners trapped by winter's grip. On the rare clear days when travel was possible, Mason accompanied Lillian to visit her father in town. These visits served multiple purposes: checking on his health, bringing supplies, and, increasingly, allowing Mason and Mr. O'Connor to become better acquainted. To Lillian's relief, the two men developed a genuine respect for each other. Her father, initially suspicious of Mason's intentions, gradually warmed to him, particularly after Mason demonstrated his knowledge of mining operations and his plans for worker safety. "He's not just after profit," Mr. O'Connor confided to Lillian during one visit while Mason helped the housekeeper bring in firewood. "He understands the risks men take going into those mountains. That's rare in a mine owner." "He's a good man," Lillian agreed, watching through the window as Mason stacked wood with the same diligence he applied to every task. "And he cares for you," her father added, his shrewd eyes studying her face. "The question is, do you care for him? Truly care, beyond gratitude for what he's done for us?" Lillian considered the question seriously. In the months since Mason had first bought her entire pie stand, her feelings had evolved from wariness to respect to something far deeper and more complex. "I do," she admitted finally. "He's unlike anyone I've ever known, strong but gentle, determined but fair. When I'm with him, I feel—" She searched for the right words. "I feel both protected and empowered, as if I'm more myself in his presence, not less." Her father nodded slowly. "That's love, Lily girl. The real kind, not the flimsy nonsense they write about in those penny novels." The simple declaration startled her. Love. Had she truly fallen in love with Mason Rourke? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Before she could respond, the door opened, admitting Mason along with a gust of cold air. "Storm's picking up again," he announced, brushing snow from his coat. "If we're to make it back to camp before dark, we should leave soon." The journey back was treacherous, the trail barely visible beneath fresh snow. Halfway up the mountain, the wind shifted, bringing with it a blinding wall of white. "Blizzard," Mason shouted over the howling gale. "We need to find shelter." He turned their horses toward a stand of pines where the company had built a small emergency cabin for just such situations. By the time they reached it, Lillian could barely feel her fingers despite her thick gloves, and Mason's beard was crusted with ice. The cabin was primitive, a single room with a stone fireplace, narrow bunk, small table, and supply shelves stocked with essentials. Mason immediately set about building a fire while Lillian checked their provisions. "We have enough to last several days if necessary," she reported, inventorying canned beans, jerky, coffee, and flour. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Mason replied, coaxing flames from kindling. "Your father will worry." "And the camp will worry about you," she countered, moving to help him with the fire. As warmth gradually filled the small space, they shed their outer layers and Lillian set about preparing a simple meal. The domestic scene, she cooking, he tending the fire, struck her with its rightness, as if they'd been partners for years rather than months. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Mason said as they sat before the fire, eating beans heated in a tin pot. "About the future." Lillian's pulse quickened. "What about it? The spring thaw will bring changes. The company is sending more men, more equipment. We'll be expanding operations significantly." He set his plate aside, his expression serious. "I'll be expected to deliver results." "You will," she assured him. "You've already proven the mine's potential." "Yes, but with expansion comes greater scrutiny, more pressure." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "I've been offered a promotion to oversee not just Silver Creek but 2 additional sites the company is developing." Pride swelled in Lillian's heart. "Mason, that's wonderful. You deserve recognition for all you've accomplished." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but it would mean more responsibility, more travel between sites." He looked directly at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Less time here." Understanding dawned. "You're worried about us." "About what it would mean for us, yes." He moved closer, taking her hand in his. "These months with you, Lillian, they've been the happiest of my life. I don't want to jeopardize what we're building together." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Whatever challenges come, we'll face them. Your success doesn't threaten what's between us. It's part of who you are, and I care for all of you, the ambitious mine foreman as much as the man who stopped to buy pies from a desperate young woman." Something in Mason's expression shifted, a tension releasing, a decision solidifying. "I had planned to wait until spring," he said softly, "to do this properly with your father's formal blessing, perhaps even a ring from Denver." He moved from his chair to kneel before her, still holding her hand. "But sitting here with you in this storm-bound shelter, I find I can't wait another day to ask what I've wanted to ask for months." Lillian's breath caught as he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Lillian O'Connor, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not just my business partner or the camp's cook, but my lifelong companion, my heart's true home." Though she had sensed the conversation's direction, the actual proposal still overwhelmed her. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow but of profound joy. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly. "Yes, Mason Rourke, I will marry you." He gathered her into his arms, his embrace conveying what words could not: protection, passion, and the promise of a shared future. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, then deepening as months of restrained emotion found release. They spent the night talking by firelight, planning their future together, the spring wedding they would have once the snows melted, the home they would build near enough to town for her father to visit easily, the family they hoped to create together. The blizzard raged on outside, but within their shelter, a different kind of storm had broken, one that cleared away the last lingering doubts and revealed the clear, bright certainty of their love. When they finally returned to camp 2 days later, Mrs. Peterson took one look at their radiant faces and declared, "Well, it's about time." News of their engagement spread through the camp like wildfire, met with genuine delight from the miners who had watched their relationship develop. Many of the men had come to see Lillian as a sister or daughter figure, and Mason's happiness reflected well on all of them. The spring of 1877 arrived with renewed promise. As the snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing the first green shoots of new growth, preparations for both the mine's expansion and the wedding proceeded apace. Lillian's father, now walking with only a slight limp thanks to Dr. Whitfield's care, threw himself into helping plan the ceremony. Though still frail, he insisted on building a wedding arch with his own hands, working slowly but steadily in the lengthening spring days. Mason, true to his word, secured his promotion while negotiating terms that would allow him to remain primarily at Silver Creek for the first year, traveling to the other sites only when necessary. He also purchased a plot of land halfway between town and the mine, where construction began on a modest but well-appointed home. As for Lillian, She continued overseeing the dining hall while gradually training assistants to take over some of her duties. The recipe book that had once served as business collateral now became a family legacy. She planned to expand with new creations, dishes born of her experiences at the camp and inspired by the love that had transformed her life. On a perfect June morning, with the mountains still snow-capped, but the valley lush with wildflowers, Lillian O'Connor became Lillian Rourke beneath her father's handcrafted arch. The entire camp and half of Silverton attended, creating a celebration unlike anything the town had seen. Dr. Whitfield stood as Mason's best man, while Mrs. Peterson, weeping happily, attended Lillian. Her father, standing straighter and prouder than he had in years, walked her down an aisle strewn with columbines, the flowers that had become a symbol of their courtship. "Who would have thought," he whispered as they approached the arch where Mason waited, "that selling pies would lead to this?" Lillian squeezed his arm. "Sometimes the sweetest outcomes come from the most desperate beginnings." Mason's face, as she approached him, contained everything she had come to love: strength tempered by tenderness, determination softened by devotion. As they exchanged vows beneath the Colorado sky, Lillian thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a humble pie stand to a partnership that would weather whatever challenges life presented. That evening, as they danced beneath lantern light to the music of miners' fiddles and harmonicas, Mason pulled her close and whispered, "Best investment I ever made, buying those pies." Lillian laughed, her heart full to bursting. "And my recipe book?" "A close second," he replied with a smile, "though I think we've only just begun writing our best recipes together." 5 years later, the Rourke home bustled with activity as Lillian prepared for the grand opening of Rourke's Bakery and Cafe, the newest establishment on Silverton's Main Street. What had begun as a pie stand had evolved into a thriving business, one that would employ several local women and serve both townspeople and the steady stream of visitors arriving on the recently completed Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Mason, now superintendent of all the company's Colorado operations, had insisted on building the bakery to his wife's specifications, complete with the finest ovens available and large windows to showcase both her creations and the spectacular mountain views. "Mama, Thomas is eating the display cookies again," called their 4-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, her auburn hair and determined expression a perfect blend of her parents. "Thomas James Rourke, those are for the guests," Lillian scolded gently, extracting her 2-year-old son from behind the counter. His face, so like Mason's in miniature, was covered in cookie crumbs and an expression of unrepentant delight. "Sorry, Mama," he mumbled, not looking sorry at all. Lillian couldn't maintain her stern expression. She wiped his face with her apron, marveling as she often did at how completely these children had captured her heart. The bell over the door jingled as Mason entered, carrying yet another delivery. "Last of the tables," he announced, setting down the polished wood with care. "Your father's bringing the chairs in the wagon." Lillian surveyed the nearly complete cafe with satisfaction. Glass cases gleamed, ready to display her pies and pastries. Tables stood in welcoming clusters, soon to be covered with checkered cloths. The recipe book that had started it all sat proudly on a special shelf behind the counter, now accompanied by 2 additional volumes filled with new creations. "What do you think?" Mason asked, sliding an arm around her waist. "Will it do?" "It's perfect," she answered truthfully. "More than I ever dreamed possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You made it possible, Lillian. Your talent, your determination." "We made it possible," she corrected, leaning into his embrace. "Together." As their children scampered about the new space, exclaiming over each detail, and her father's wagon appeared outside the window. Lillian felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. From a desperate young woman selling pies to survive, she had become the heart of a thriving family, a successful business, and a love story that still unfolded with each passing day. The journey hadn't always been easy. There had been challenges aplenty, from harsh winters to mining accidents to the everyday struggles of building a life in the still Wild West. But through it all, the partnership she and Mason had forged remained unshakable, a foundation as solid as the mountains that surrounded them, and as sweet as the pies that had brought them together. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed and her father had returned to his comfortable cottage nearby, Lillian and Mason stood on their porch, gazing at the star-filled sky above Silverton. "You ever think about that day?" Mason asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "When I bought your entire stand and that precious recipe book?" "Often," Lillian admitted with a smile. "Though I was certain at first you were either mad or mocking me." He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Neither. Just a man who recognized quality when he tasted it." His voice softened. In both the pies and their maker, Lillian turned in his embrace, looking up at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own yet still caused her heart to quicken. "I love you, Mason Rourke, more with each passing day. And I love you, Lillian Rourke." He kissed her beneath the Colorado stars, his arms solid and sure around her. "My partner, my heart, my home." Inside the house, her mother's recipe book lay open to a new page, where Lillian had begun recording a different kind of recipe, one for happiness, built from equal parts hard work and tender care, seasoned with laughter and patience, and given time to mature into something that, like the best of her pies, only grew richer and more satisfying with each passing year.